So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Steve Drucker. I'm the founder and president of Fig Leaf Software, and I'll be your special celebrity guest instructor for today's case study in migrating content from Ektron into Drupal. So first, we'll talk a little bit about my company, and then we'll get into the case study and get into maybe a little bit of a pseudo-technical discussion as to what's involved in migrating a website from .NET and SQL Server over into Drupal 7. And then hopefully we'll have some time for a few questions at the end. Also brought along Will Kirchheimer. So Will is a senior software engineer at my company. My involvement in this was as a project manager on the content migration side. So a little bit about us. Been in business for about 25 years. I actually started the company after graduating from the University of Maryland with a degree in computer science. And we're a pretty broad company. We work with a lot of different CMSs on a lot of different platforms. We build custom applications or single-page web applications. We're now doing some Amazon Alexa work, Node.js, PHP, Adobe Cold Fusion. Kind of got our start doing Cold Fusion. Anybody here use Cold Fusion before? Okay, yeah, wow, Word. It's pretty good. And some of the websites that we've developed and launched, you've probably actually had some exposure to. The one we're going to be talking about today is BSEE, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. But if you've been on the Metro website in the last, since about December, this is a new site that we developed for those guys. Pretty cool, very nice responsive site. Also, the National Park Service, nps.gov, we've been managing their infrastructure and their web initiatives for about the last 15 years. And exim.gov, which is in Drupal 7. And so, again, 3 different examples on really 3 different platforms using a bunch of different technologies. In addition, we also have a training division. So actually some of the courseware that we've built is available for sale on Amazon.com, and we do in-person training and remote training got about 8 different Drupal courses spanning everything from site building with Drupal all the way through complex module development. So like I said, we work with a lot of different organizations. We've also manage and host websites on Amazon EC2 and Google Cloud, as well as Microsoft's Cloud, and are an Acquia partner. And there's just a few of the websites that are currently up and running produced by us over the years. Okay. So what we're here to talk about today is a site that we launched, I guess, the middle of last year for the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, or collectively known as BSEE. BSEE was actually created after the Deepwater Horizon incident, and their charter deals with not only oil well inspection, but a whole host of environmental inspection issues. Originally, their site was produced in Ektron.net, and we were selected because we were both an Ektron partner as well as an Acquia partner. So we actually knew both ends of the system and how to move from one to the other. As part of that Drupal 7 migration, we were using OpenGov. It's actually a variant of OpenGov called OpenDOI. DOI is Department of Interior, of which BSEE is a part of. So there's an initiative within the Department of Interior and its very many groups to move everyone over to that OpenDOI platform. So the objectives, BSEE was actually kind of an interesting site in that most of their content is actually file-based. They've got a ton of different PDF files. They actually had 11,000 PDF files, which actually had to be moved over from Ektron over into Drupal. And along with that, most of their PDF files did not meet any kind of Section 508 accessibility compliance. So part of the gig was, there were really 2 major components to the gig. First is how do we migrate them from Ektron onto Drupal and remap their content into something that's going to be easier for folks to find. But then also, how do we take the existing content and make it in both file format and also unstructured database content and make it Section 508 compliant to meet the Americans with Disabilities Act. So as part of that, we went through a fairly significant discovery phase, a lot of which was programmatic. So we would use things like site crawlers to walk through the site because we had a fairly deep understanding of the Microsoft SQL Server database schema that was involved with Ektron. We'd write a ton of ad hoc queries and go and analyze that current content. We'd look at things like Google Analytics to see what the most popular content was on the site and how many clicks it was taking for people to locate that. And we set our IA people to work, who ultimately produced a web content mapping, big, giant Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that we worked through with Bessie to show where the content existed on their current site and how that might map over to content types in Drupal and what those URLs might ultimately be in the ultimately produced site. And then we also set up some business rules for which content could be programmatically migrated versus which content would have to be manually migrated, and of course which content could actually be thrown out. So this was one of those initiatives that had to be done very quickly. There was a political reason why the site had to launch on a very specific date, and so I think we had about roughly about 4 months to go from 4 or 5 months to go from start to finish, which is fairly quick, particularly since we had to migrate 11,000 PDF files and run those through an accessibility check and accessibility fix process. So there were actually 2 different groups that were working in parallel on this. There were the Drupal site developers who were working on building out the site using the new design which our folks had created. And I've actually got a before and after here. So let's see. So this is the current site that we produced and launched in Drupal 7, and then the previous site I think I've got over here. So this was their previous site, which was in Ektron. So some of the challenges that we had was, while Ektron had a metadata system or vocabulary system in place, it wasn't actually being used by the folks at the agency, or it was being used in a very haphazard way. So out of that, as part of that data conversion process, we actually had about 15 people who went through and read all of the content on the existing Bessie site over a period of, I think it was about 4 or 5 weeks, to accurately categorize the content. We had talked about doing keyword extraction. We talked about doing a lot of different programmatic things, but one of the challenges that you find with data migration, and this is probably my 5th or 6th data migration over the last 20 years, is that programmatic migration it's very difficult to achieve 100% accuracy, and folks tend to complain about the 2%. If it's even off by 2%, it becomes very visible, and they will complain about that. And data conversion it's a very thankless job in computing. Most of the folks who do data conversion, if it's their very first one, they tend to quit after they've completed that data conversion job. And in fact, one of my first jobs in computing after I graduated with a degree in computer science was to actually migrate a 50-table SQL Server database over to a 120-table SQL Server database. And at the end of that process, I decided I needed to grow the company by a lot, so I would never have to do that again. Okay. So just to put this out there for any of you who are going to put people on data migration, make sure that there's a bonus, a retention bonus at the end of that, because it's always a thankless task. It's one of those things where, if you're building a site in Drupal, you can kind of go to your friends and say, hey, check out this cool new site that I built. And there's a lot of job satisfaction along with that. It's a lot harder to say, hey, go to the site and notice that all the content's in the right place. That's a little harder to quantify. It's a little bit like walking into a library and saying, well, gee, this library is really neat, but but I got to complain because there's 3 books sitting out on the desk. It's a lot like that. So it's a very thankless job, and I always sit down with developers before we undertake these things. I think you need to have the right level of expectation as the developer on the project, and then the client has to have the proper expectation. There is going to be some end user cleanup there at the end, right? So there's some qualitative quality of life issues. In fact, that very first content management job or content migration job that I did, I was bringing a pillow into work because it would actually take all night for that job to execute, and I'd have to check on it every hour to make sure that it hadn't broken, restart it, and all that. So you learn a lot of lessons, a lot of life lessons as part of that, as well as always make sure you have a client that has a comfortable couch. This is about 20 years ago. So again, so you're looking through this, you have to determine which content's going to be migrated, whether some of it's going to be manual, some of it's going to be programmatic. Setting expectations with the customer is absolutely key for that. And as part of the data migration process, just kind of skipping away, when you build out your algorithms to do those moves, make sure you build them in such a way that it's very granular, so you can go and execute this on specific content types or specific sections, and you can kind of stop and restart it at various points in the process. Because you're talking about a lot of data. I mean, this was, I think, about, relatively speaking, it's not a lot of data, but it's about, I think, about 15 gig of data overall. So just kind of doing the site backups, moving that stuff around, re-executing it. You don't want a process where you start it and you're not going to know 24 hours from now whether it's done, which is sometimes how long it takes. So do it so you can do it in little bits and say, okay, yeah, it looks good. Let's go and and fire it off. One of the things that made this project again more challenging is that we actually had to separate out the PDF files from the regular content, because the PDF files had to have special treatment by a group of about 15 content remediators who spent 3 months using Adobe Acrobat Pro and a product called Common Look to go and validate that they were all accessible, and most of the times they weren't, and actually go through and remediate that. So you go out there and you take a look at the existing content, decide, is there going to be direct mapping to content types? A lot of times in legacy systems, some of the things that you have in those systems may wind up turning into vocabularies and not content types. So you got to kind of make that decision. And in terms of restructuring, again, you may be changing URLs, changing file paths, and as part of that, again, from a programmatic standpoint, when you're creating these processes to do the imports, make sure that you're creating audit trails. A lot of the time you spend is just making sure that everything I do, I've written out to a log exactly what happened, so I can either undo it if I need to do it, or I can take that data and feed it off to a secondary or maybe a tertiary process to make that happen. So, the first step is, of course, back up your content database. It's amazing to me, and Bessie didn't fall into this category, but it's still amazing to me how many folks aren't actually doing regular backups, or if they are, they're not restoring periodically to make sure that their backup is a good backup. Right? So in this case, we were backing up our Microsoft SQL Server database. We had written some code to go and pull that data out of Microsoft SQL Server and export it as tab-separated value files, or something that could be read in through the Drupal feeds module. Get into cleaning the data. So this is setting up business rules to make sure that we're not bringing over data that's more than, say, 5 years old or 10 years old or whatever that threshold is, and having that understanding. So then we're importing the content into Drupal using the feeds module, and there's a bunch of related modules to that that allow you to take the data that's coming in and programmatically tweak it before actually injecting it into the Drupal CMS. And then, of course, you go through the testing process. Again, this kind of comes down to a level of expectation. So you need to kind of be clear with everybody that the first run of the data is probably going to look like a disaster, and that's okay, right? So a lot of times you go, okay, yeah, you ran all the data in last night. Now let me go to the site and check it out. And it's boom, right? So you go, don't worry, this is going to be an iterative process. A lot of this is always, we'll fix it, we'll get it there. So you go through that refining of scripts. And again, this is kind of really what I'm getting to when I talked about creating scripts that you could start and stop very easily that would run relatively quickly. You don't want to have that 1 day of latency, or even an hour of latency before you can check the results and make refinements. You need to be making refinements as quickly as possible. And so this kind of gives you 5, 6, and 7 is where you're going to spend a lot of time, a lot of refinement as you bring that data in, make sure it's getting categorized correctly, make sure there aren't broken links and whatnot, and then running link checkers and all that good kind of standard stuff. Bessie was kind of interesting in the sense that about 3/4 of the content were actually PDF files. So there were a couple things that had to happen there. One is that Ektron actually exported data through XML, so we kind of used their built-in content exporter to export all the URLs, as well as writing some directed SQL queries just directly against their SQL Server database. But the nice thing about Ektron is most of their PDF files were actually stored in one directory. So in one file folder, it had about 8,500 files, and so that was fairly easy to quantify. And then we had another about 2,500 files that were just spread all throughout the directory system, directory structure, and those were a little bit harder to work with. My advice, and this is going to be a little counterintuitive, if you have to go back and do something like this where your PDF files are this separate entity that need to be checked for Section 508, is when you import them into Drupal, maintain the same file names if possible, and again, dump them all into one folder, because again, we had parallel processes going on. We had folks who were importing, writing the import to go from Ektron into Drupal, but then we also had separate folks who were actually tweaking the content of those documents themselves, and we kind of needed to bring that stuff together. So one of the things that our Drupal devs did is they took the original PDF file names and they changed the PDF file names and threw those into the Drupal file system. And so that just made things a little bit more complicated. Anytime we'd have this big file of PDFs that were being modded by our Section 508 folks, and we had to write a special routine to pull it out of that monolithic directory structure and then drop it and overwrite the files in the Drupal CMS. So we kind of set ourselves up for a little bit of extra work there had we just kind of tried to maintain the directory structure for the PDFs as much as possible. So for the Drupal import modules, feeds and feed tamper were a big part of what we used to pull that information out of Ektron or to take the data that we had exported from Ektron, import it into content types and vocabulary. Along the way, we were using feeds debug to kind of verify that what we were doing was the correct mapping based on some of the Excel spreadsheets and strategy that we had laid out, and features. So again, because of the large volume of data, we were setting up multiple instances on Amazon EC2 and running those pretty constantly, moving data back and forth all the time. So with PDF and Section 508 compliance, if someone asks you to make 11,000 PDF files Section 508 compliant, I can tell you that it's over 3 months. That's kind of a big deal. So we actually hired about 15 people off the street. We actually developed a PDF accessibility. It was a one-day Adobe Acrobat PDF accessibility course. We put them through that training, as well as had them use a product called Common Look. And then I issued everybody a quota. I said, you will get through 8 PDF files a day, regardless of file size. And that worked great in the beginning when most of the PDF files were 2 pages, 4 pages, 8 pages. Towards the end of the process, when you had a 700-page document, that started to get a little bit more unreasonable. So generally our target was roughly an average of about 30 to 45 minutes per document to actually make those Section 508 compliant, which was a requirement as part of the contract. And again, a lot of that comes down to tagging, and I won't get into the details of Section 508 accessibility for Adobe PDF files, but that was a big part of the job, and had to happen in parallel in order to make the deadline. We couldn't do the import into Drupal and then edit the PDF files on the Drupal site. It had to happen while the Drupal site was being developed in order to make the aggressive deadline. So when you're dealing with gigs and gigs and gigs of files, just moving them around becomes a little bit of a challenge. So we were doing quite a bit of work tarring PDF files, a lot of tar, a lot of FTP, a lot of SCP copies, moving the files around. We'd written some additional scripts to move things around in PHP and Adobe Cold Fusion. And then associating those files with the actually brought the files in and for the most part created content objects for each file or around each file using feeds Tamper. Okay. And again, changing the name. So this would be, if I had to do it all over again, this is something that I would probably not do, which is change the file name from the original Ektron name. Keep those file names the same, and that way, when you're ready to move the remediated files over and drop them into place, it just becomes a lot easier to do so. So in, again, kind of just talking about how files are stored in Ektron, they've got this notion of managed files and unmanaged files. Unmanaged files are all stored in one big location, one directory. Managed files are stored throughout the entire directory structure. So this was a matter of writing some SQL to go and figure out what those files were and where they were located and pull them out. And then our data feed from Ektron was XML, and we wrote something, convert the XML over to TSV so that it could be used by the feeds module to bring that data, import that data into our different content types. So we set up a clone of the customer's Ektron site, which was in production at the time, and then went through and wrote some SQL, used a combination of writing custom SQL and XML to pull data out of these different SQL Server tables, which fortunately is not hugely complicated. They've got a fairly flat database scheme in Ektron. So that generated a list of content IDs. And we could use a SOAP web service in Ektron to pull the data then out of the CMS and put it into a format which could then be migrated into Drupal using the feeds module. So in keeping with the strategy of trying to reduce these down so you're not running the entire import all in one shot, we created separate processing scripts for each content type. So we could make sure that each one was operating reasonably well before we moved on to the other. And again, a big part of this was making sure that we had detailed audit trails in a format which could be consumed programmatically to then apply any little cleanup fixes that we needed to work. And that really turned out to be a huge lifesaver. Okay. So then you can see we had all kinds of different scripts for each content type, basically had its own execution script which could run independently. Okay. And so you can see we had a lot of different content object types which got imported. Some of which involved PDF files, some of which didn't, some of which we of course needed to bring over all the images and remap all the URLs to the images, and all the hyperlinks had to be remapped. So it was definitely a crunch trying to make that happen. Okay. So the feeds Tamper module allows you to take that data before it gets written out to the CMS to go and tweak it, do things like convert file name case, removing HTML tags, doing various find and replaces, which we had to do for file paths, because of course all the file paths were changing from Ektron into Drupal. And then on the QA side, again, this is one of those things that always takes a little bit longer than you expect. So we had issues related to date-time formats, because dealing with date formats is painful on every platform. It's one of those things I wish everybody who builds a CMS would just store date times as number of seconds since the epoch or something like that. But it's my own personal pet peeves dealing with that. Making sure the metadata came over. A lot of what we did revolved around making sure our counts were correct. So if we had 3,000 content types, we need to make sure 3,000 actually made it in to Drupal. Verifying the taxonomy terms got properly applied. You also run into issues with special characters, where I don't think the database in Ektron was actually UTF-8. So if you're moving from a non-UTF-8 character set to UTF-8, you can run into issues there. So one of the kind of lesser known gotchas We found that during the input process that cron kept trying to delete everything that we were doing. So that was a little disconcerting. And we were able to fix that by, I'm trying to remember exactly how we, right.
While they were considered in use, they were also considered temporary. So people would try to delete all the temporary files, and then people would say, oh, no, it's in use. So it created a massive job for 10,000 files.
Yeah. Yeah, oops. Right. Yeah, and the issues that you run into with working with this much content, as Will indicated, tend to be both somewhat hilarious and yet terrifying at the same time. Why do I have 10,000 cron jobs running? Oops. And again, that's why you kind of want to set this up on an EC2 instance that you can kill very, very easily. Although when you get the CPU bill for that, you'll probably also be very unhappy. So, you get into some of these issues like, what if people are still working on content while you migrate? So again, this was kind of a 3-month process. It wasn't realistic to go to folks and say, hey, stop working on your site for 3 months while we go and deal with this. So there were, a number of different things that we used for that. I think ultimately we had a cutoff of about, I think it was like the final week. We said, look, okay, there's a content freeze here for this final week while we move everything over and verify it. But again, this kind of comes down to on the PDF side, we're writing all of the scripts in such a way that they can be executed with files from a certain last edit date. Okay, so you can say, okay, we're going to do everything up to today, and then we'll deal with the stuff in phases. And another tool that you can use is called Gather Content. So Gather Content has a nice little Drupal integration that allows you to kind of do a continuing synchronization from your feeds. Okay. Oops. So, just to wrap up, planning is critical. One of the things that a manager used to tell me all the time was speed kills, right? So this was kind of one of those things where the procurement was a little late. The project got off to, a start as early as it could, but it was still a very tight turnaround. So as a result, the customer said, hey, look, we got these 12,000 or 11,000 PDF files. We're going to give them to you today. You can start working on them. Well, it turned out that out of those 11,000 PDF files, we only really need to migrate about 8,000 at the end of the day. So there's a lot of extra work that wound up getting done because we hadn't figured out what those parameters were yet. And again, communicating early and setting the proper level of expectation. It's a little bit like screen readers and doing text-to-speech. If it's 99%, successful, all you're going to hear about is the complaints about that last 1%. So setting expectations is really key for the development team and the client. And lots of PDF testing tools that are out there. A company called Common Look, they actually have a product which will spider through your site and validate that all of your PDF files are actually Section 508 compliant or not. Got some really good validation tools there. But again, it takes time to remediate some of these issues. We had external test consultants on the Section 508 side, so we were looking at it internally as well as having an external group look at it, because when you produce a site for the government, if it's not 508 compliant, somebody's getting sued. So there's very low threshold of pain there. Everything's got to be good to go. So I think that takes us to 1 minute for questions. Any questions? Yes.
Is Common Look a premium product or is that a free product?
No. Common Look is a premium product. It's relatively expensive, but I will say that one of the big challenges you have with PDFs is dealing with tables in PDFs, and it'll pay for itself just because of that one specific feature. So, yeah.
I guess there are other questions. How many of these do you see migration RFPs from other CMS platforms to Drupal? And then just also, Can you tell me the motivation for them moving from Ektron to Drupal?
Sure, yeah. So the question is, how often do we see this? Pretty much every deal that we're pitching at this point involves some level of content migration. There's the folks who are moving to Drupal are not moving from a previous version of Drupal. They're moving from another technology like Cold Fusion, or they're moving from .NET. A lot of our, I'd say about 50 to 60% of our practice is public sector government, and there's been a huge move in the DC area to move from whatever CMS you have to Drupal. And so that's been the motivation. I won't comment as to whether it's fiscally responsible for an agency that's very successful with their current CMS on their current technology platform to move to Drupal, but that's kind of the reality, right? So most of the sites, most if not all the Drupal 7, Drupal 8 sites that we're doing are all
Right. So just broad strokes, you might see 10 of these a quarter or something like that.
Yeah, you're going to see pretty much everyone. Everything that we're pitching right now, I'd say it's all the public sector stuff is Drupal, and with very few exceptions, and they're moving from something to Drupal. And then all the private sector stuff, I'd say it's about 50-50 Drupal and .NET.
Great, thanks.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Just as an organization that's currently on Ektron right now and looking to migrate in the next 6 months, I can speak to your question and say that we want to switch because Ektron is a terrible garbage fire. But one thing that we're very worried about, I don't know if you had to deal with any user data. Was any of that migrated as well?
No, it's not a membership-based site, so we didn't have to worry about user data. We were an Ektron partner. I had not actually messed around with Ektron until this project. Well, I'm being recorded, so I won't say what, but I share your general sentiment of what? Like, what? But actually, they got bought by another company which has its own CMS, and they killed Ektron. So in that case, they're moving. Their motivation for moving is Ektron's no longer really a directly supported product. It's not, and moving from Ektron to, I think it's Sitefinity, is, that's a migration effort in itself. So if you have a migration effort, you might as well evaluate a bunch of different products at that point. So,
Thank you.
yeah, sure. Yep, anybody else? Okay, very good. Well, we can help you out with that migration, by the way. All right, well, thanks everybody for coming. Again, my name's Steve Drucker, and appreciate your time. Yeah, we'll be posting the deck. Not sure who we're supposed to get it to at the conference, but we'll get it to the conference. Yeah, we'll get it to the conference. It's Google Slides, so it'll just be a URL.